We had troops stationed for decades, and we had a terrible withdrawal, and we have women, particularly and young girls, at the mercy of the Taliban. We spend a considerable amount of money in Ukraine, of course, for all the reasons that you will understand, given the war in Ukraine. Nigeria, Somalia, Ethiopia, those are the countries that receive the largest amount of UK aid spending. We are a member of the UN Security Council, one of the 5 nations, along with France, China, and Russia, that are part of the UN Security Council, along with the United States. The United States is the biggest funder of aid globally, 55.3 billion spent by the United States. Germany spends $35 billion. Japan spends 17.5 billion US dollars. France spends 15.9 billion dollars, and as I've told you, we spend 15.7 billion. Back in 1970, we committed to spend 0.7% of our aid budget, or to move along in that journey. It took us a long time to get there. We didn't get there until 2015, but we've cut back from the 0.7% to 0.5%. But just to be clear, even with that 0.5% budget and the 15.7 billion pounds that we're spending, quite a lot of it we're actually spending in this country. We're spending 3.7 billion of our aid budget in housing refugees, effectively, and hosting refugees in Britain. Now, most of them are Ukrainian, but there are many, many other people who know this business about housing refugees, particularly in hotels. That's coming from the UK aid budget. And the decision by the government to scrap the Department for International Development and to cut our aid budget mean that there are lots of things that we were supporting that were suddenly cut dramatically. Our aid money helps to vaccinate 12 million children in the past from preventable diseases. Do you think that's important? It supported particularly girls to go to primary school across much of the developed world. 15.3 million the Department for International Development spent on enabling girls to go to primary school. It's done a lot of work to support women with sexual health, to stop things like female genital mutilation. Maybe women listening will pleased or happy that their taxpayers' money has helped support other women who stood in solidarity with those young girls across much of the global community. We don't do it on our own. A lot of our money goes towards multilateral funds. That means we support other, working with G7 countries like Japan and others to make sure our money goes very far. Of course, vaccination is really important to prevent disease, to save money down the line, because we're vaccinating children across much of the developed world, and working, of course, with charities like Save the Children, like Oxfam, like ActionAid, to get and support those millennium goals, which were established by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, working with others to really reduce child poverty, particularly across the world, and also help countries deal with the climate emergency. So that's what our aid budget has spent on. And the question is, in 2024, can we afford to spend that money on those issues? Has Britain got a moral obligation to spend money on those issues as a global power, as a country on the UN Security Council? Is it important that we spend funds in that way? And does spending funds in that way stop some of the issues that will only come to our borders? Issues like extremism, issues like why people flee countries and migration. If you're not supporting, if you like, growth in the Horn of Africa and Robert Jenrick thinks that we've got to cut that money further, not just to 0.5%, but we've got to cut it probably down to something like 0.2.5%, and we've got to spend that money on defence, because we know that there are issues with defence spending in Europe at this time. Across European countries, we're spending about 2.1% of our GDP on defence. But with Russia behaving the way it is, with concerns about China in the Taiwan Straits, a lot of people believe that Europe has got to raise its game. We've heard Donald Trump saber-rattling about NATO and whether, in fact, European countries are paying their fair share. France and the UK represent 50% of Europe's defence budget. And many people believe that the UK has to be spending more like 2.5% on its defence budget. Well, Jenrick says to get that money, we should cut our aid budget. I've got to say, cutting our aid budget would not provide enough money for defence. So I think Robert gets it wrong when he suggests that. But you might also say, hang on a minute, how can we have been stationed in Afghanistan, and left under the circumstances we left, and then not feel prepared to support young women who are not being paid, to support families across Afghanistan who are starving, by the way, and a lot of starvation in Afghanistan as a result of weather, conflict, the Taliban's bad run, if you like, of that country particularly. And for example, should we not be spending the 30 million that we pledged to the Palestinian people? Would you want Britain to withdraw from when we talk about aid going into Palestine, again, it's taxpayers' money that funds that aid to go into Palestine. We know not nearly enough of what's going in, but at the moment we've got the UK dropping aid parcels over Palestine. That's our aid budget. Should we be spending that money in Palestine? It sounds like Robert Jenrick thinks that it's money not well spent. We need to cut back on that money. You saw the horrendous floods that lost so many people's lives in Pakistan. There'll be lots of people listening who have Pakistani origins. Again, should Britain be spending that money? And Britain has a relationship, best seen through the Commonwealth, parts of the Caribbean, parts of the Pacific, substantial parts of Africa, because of our history, from which we gained a lot. And that's why you might say it's important for Britain to hold out an arm, particularly to those countries. So not all countries in the world, but particularly those countries like Nigeria, countries like Ghana, like Kenya, where we have a deep relationships. Now, we spend far less time in the Caribbean region because many of those countries are what we call middle-income economies like Barbados. So there isn't a lot of money, actually, aid money, if any, going to a country like Barbados. But where you've still got countries with tremendous poverty, there is a commitment. Now, some say, why are we spending aid money in China? And we are. Some say, why are we spending aid money in India? And we are. Now, we know there's a lot of poverty in India. But some might say, hang on a minute, India's economy is booming. It's got a rising middle class. Surely the Indians and the Indian government should be picking up the tab for their problems, not the British taxpayer. And is that a legitimate debate? You know, there's scarce funds. Should we still be funding aid to China and aid to India? Call me on 0345 6060 973. Let's talk about whether you agree with Robert Jenrick. Is he right? Should we be cutting our foreign aid budget further? Is defence spending more important? Or do we have a moral responsibility as a global power to help nations that are less well off? Call me on 0345 6060 973. Mick in Sutton Coldfield says, David, anyone who's the knowledge of defence knows that the part of the aid budget plays in stability in volatile regions, and as a result of that stability, not needing to get involved in more combat operations is vitally important. So reducing the aid budget potentially leads to more overstretching for the military, not less. That's a strong point from Nick, it seems to me, in Sutton Coldfield. And another one here from Orpington, from Shovik. David, aid should continue for all the regions you referred to, not least to deal with the terrorism and the climate emergency in those economies, understanding that it was countries like the UK that gave those countries a climate emergency, not those countries themselves. Aid should go through UN agencies and British registered charities. A lot of our aid actually does go through the multilateral system, and a lot of that is run from the UK. So let's talk about aid and how important. There'll be people out there who contribute to Christian Aid, Oxfam, Action Aid, for example, and care a lot about aid. Comic Relief, for example. There'll be people out there who care a lot about our defence and know that our armed forces are being expected to live in housing that's poor, use facility that's poor, have kit that's poor. So we definitely need to think about defence spending. But is the answer to cut the aid budget, given that the aid budget has already been cut substantially, and a lot of it is currently being spent not abroad, but in this country, housing refugees? Call me after the break. You listen to David Lammy here on LBC. The time now is 11:17.
This is LBC. Life is full of choices, both big and small. Like whether 2024 is the year you finally move home, or decide it's better to stay put, or what series to watch next when you're not moving from your sofa. And did you know you also have a choice when it comes to your healthcare? If your GP suggests you see a specialist, you can choose where you go. This could be a hospital with shorter waiting times, a hospital closer to family or friends, or easier to get to. It's your patient choice. To find out more about choosing your hospital, visit nhs.uk/